Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Hugh McKay, Vice President of the City Club of Cleveland. The City Club is pleased to welcome Thomas A. Schatz, President of Citizens Against Government Waste. If you saw President Obama's State of the Union address this week, you heard the President declare that he would veto any legislation containing earmarks of any sort. Senator Majority Leader Harry Reid immediately declared that President Obama is, quote, absolutely wrong, unquote, and that he, quote, should back off and let us do what we do, unquote. But Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois, the number 2 Democrat in the Senate, commented that the Senate is, quote, out of the business of earmarks, unquote. Meanwhile, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, calls himself the, quote, number 1 earmarks guy, unquote, in Congress. The House, under Speaker John Boehner, with the support of the Tea Party, has adopted its own earmark ban. But while many legislators from both parties thunder against pork barrel spending, they still improvise ways to direct money for pet projects back to their home districts. In short, earmarks bringing home the pork, government waste in general, have long been controversial topics and arguably time-honored traditions in America. Especially now with the pressing call for deficit reduction, today there are front-burner issues presented here, which brings us to Tom Schatz and his Citizens Against Government Waste. The nonpartisan Citizens Against Government Waste was founded under President Reagan and has as its mission to eliminate waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement in government. And it has attracted more than 1 million members and supporters nationwide. According to the Office of Management and Budget and CAGW estimates, implementation of CAGW waste-cutting recommendations has helped save taxpayers $1.2 trillion. Mr. Schatz is a nationally recognized spokesperson on government waste. He appears regularly on national television news programs, including ABC's Good Morning America, 60 Minutes, The O'Reilly Factor, NBC Nightly News, and the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. He's also regularly featured as a guest on CNBC's popular Pork Watch segment, and maybe a Food Channel show called Man vs. Pork someday. Mr. Schatz's editorials on fiscal policy have appeared in publications nationwide, and he has testified numerous times on government waste before committees of the Senate and the House. Mr. Schatz holds a law degree from George Washington University, and he graduated from the State University of New York at Binghamton with honors in political science. The City Club welcomes Tom Schatz to the City Club.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Very glad to be back at the City Club. I was last here in 2006. At that time, the budget deficit was $248 billion. Today, it's a record $1.5 trillion. That's the estimate from the Congressional Budget Office that just came out on Wednesday. And for those of you that can't do the math that quickly in your heads, that's a 5,000+% increase. Not a 100%, it doesn't double, triple, 5,000% larger. 1 year, the difference between revenues and expenditures. In 2006, the national debt was $8.5 trillion. Today, it's $14.1 trillion. That's only a 67% increase. So comparatively, the debt is going up a little slower than the deficit. But the debt, of course, is the accumulation of all of these annual deficits over the years. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why spending has become such a big issue. As a percentage of the gross domestic product, in other words, the output of the United States, the debt right now, the deficits in the last 3 years, all over $1 trillion, have exceeded 9% of GDP. And while we are not Greece or Ireland yet, the Congressional Budget Office report did use those countries as examples of where the United States might be going unless we get all of this under control. Interest on the debt. Now think of the interest that people pay on credit cards or interest on the mortgage that they've taken out on their homes. It's $435 billion in this fiscal year, 2011. That's the 4th largest expenditure in the government. By the end of this decade, It could be the largest expenditure. Now imagine if you have credit cards and all you can do is afford to pay interest on the debt with all of the income that you have. Clearly, you'd be bankrupt. And unfortunately, without major changes, that's the direction this country could be going in. The $1.5 trillion deficit is more than the government spent from 1940 through 1961. That included all of World War II and the Korean War. Now, at the end of this decade, the gross domestic product, or gross national product, I should say, will be $22.8 trillion, and the debt will be $23.7 trillion. So the debt will now exceed the output of the country. This is not something that we can keep affording to do, and that's one of the reasons why when the President talked about earmarks, he was taking a step in the right direction, but earmarks are a very small part of the budget. I hope you all have or will get a copy of our 2010 Congressional Pig Book Summary. This is a compilation of the most egregious examples out of our database of the 2010 Congressional Pig Book, where we had 9,129 projects worth $16.5 billion. So to put that number in perspective, $16.5 billion is 0.5% of the $3.5 trillion federal budget this year. Getting rid of them doesn't solve the problem. And the President also said he wants to freeze spending for 5 years. Let's talk about what that means. Freezing spending for 5 years keeps everything where it is. We have a $1.5 trillion deficit. It's simply going to keep at levels above $1 trillion during that period of time. We can't afford to just freeze spending. In the past 2 years, non-defense spending, these are agencies like the Department of Labor, Education, Commerce, Health and Human Services, even everything except defense. That spending has increased by about 24%. So when the Republicans in the House in particular say they want to bring levels back to 2008, then back to 2006, everybody talks about it as if it's the end of the world. But what they're doing is cutting out this massive increase in spending that has occurred over the last 4 years. And I think people would be hard-pressed to argue that all of that spending has helped us recover from the recession. And we can talk about the TARP and we can talk about some of the other things that have been done. But just spending by the government generally, the stimulus, a lot of other programs that have been vastly expanded, we can certainly afford to go back to where we were a few years ago. Any other organization facing this daunting debt would be taking immediate steps to get their spending under control. Any organization that's not the government would have to do that to stay in business. But the government can just go and take our money and spend it, and unless we demand the kinds of changes that need to be made and make it clear that it's something we all understand needs to be done, they're just not going to do it. Now, it's possible that the election in November sent this kind of message. Certainly the President last year in his State of the Union didn't talk about ending earmarks, and he talked about a 3-year budget freeze. We didn't get the 3-year budget freeze. We got another increase in spending. And he signed bills that contained, over the period he has been president, $35 billion in earmarks. So there's another reason why it's very difficult to eliminate spending, and that's the inherent business of Washington, where members of Congress sit on various committees, and they have campaign contributions, and they have interests, and they get into what we call a stovepipe mentality. And that means that their vision is here. They don't see what's over there. You could have the same program as the people at this table, accomplishing exactly the same mission, but all you're going to care about is your program, the money you're getting for your reelection, and you don't really care about them, even though, again, in another organization, looking at the whole room, somebody would say, well, wait, which one is doing it better? They don't ask a lot of those questions in Washington. So there's a letter that was recently sent to the Secretary of Agriculture that really points out why it's difficult to eliminate even the most obvious examples of waste. Dear Sir, my friend Ed Peterson over at Wells Township in Iowa claims he received a check for $1,000 from the government for not raising hogs. So I want to go into the not raising hogs business next year. What I want to know is, what is the best kind of farm not to raise hogs, and what is the best breed of hogs not to raise? I want to be sure that I approach this in keeping with all governmental policies. Now, I would prefer not to raise Razorbacks, but if that's not a good breed to raise, then I would just as gladly not raise Yorkshires or Durocs. And by the way, your county agent agreed to help, but I decided to appeal directly to you because he showed me all the paperwork I need to get money not to raise hogs. Now, the hardest part of this program will be keeping an accurate inventory of how many hogs I'm not raising. My friend Peterson is very joyful about the future of the business. He's been raising hogs for 25 years or so, and the best he ever made on them was $422 in 1998. Until this year, he got your check for $1,000 for not raising any hogs. If I get $1,000 for not raising 50 hogs, well, I get $2,000 for not raising 100 hogs. I want to operate on a small scale at first, so I'll hold myself down to about 4,000 hogs not raised. It'll give me about $80,000 in the first year. Now, another thing. These hogs I will not raise will not eat 100,000 bushels of corn. I understand you also pay farmers not to raise corn or wheat. Will I qualify for payments for not raising the corn to not feed the 4,000 hogs I'm not going to raise? I'm also considering the not milking cows business, so please send me information on that as well. I don't have any experience in not milking cows, but I feel that by the time I have learned how to make out the proper forms for not raising hogs, I can qualify to make out forms for not milking cows. And of course, in view of these circumstances, you understand I will be totally unemployed and plan to file for unemployment and food stamps. But be assured that your boss, the president, will have my vote in the next election. Patriotically yours, John Stevens. Now, whether or not this is true, it does point out a problem in Washington. Programs are created with good intentions, yet outlive their usefulness. Many agriculture programs were created in the 1930s as a response to the Great Depression. It was an emergency. 70 years, 80 years later, apparently it's still an emergency. There have been numerous efforts to move our farm and agriculture system to fewer subsidies. And we could spend a lot of time talking about why it's there and how it's there. But it's there. And not every crop is subsidized, in fact. There are a few programs that account for most of the subsidies. Corn, wheat, cotton, rice, and soybeans. Right? They account for about 70% of farm subsidies. And the other problem is at the Department of Agriculture itself. Right? There are 960,000 farmers in the U.S. and 105,000 USDA employees, or about 10 farmers for every bureaucrat. So there's no truth to the story that a USDA employee told his superiors one day that he was very depressed because he heard that his farmer died. In 1981, there were 2 million farmers and 97,000 USDA employees. Since then, farmers have dropped by 1.1 million, that's 53%, but the number of USDA employees has increased by 8,000. Washington, as we often say, is a logic-free zone. Get inside that beltway and everything changes. And members of Congress then develop what we call Potomac fever. It's a spending disease that's very difficult to get rid of once you have it. The new members of Congress, many of them have come in and said, we're going to cut spending, and we mean it. And it will be very interesting to see how long that lasts and how serious they are about cutting spending. They have already made a number of proposals that would move Congress and move Washington into a much less expensive situation for taxpayers. Congressman Kevin Brady has a bill to cut $136 billion. Senator Rand Paul has a bill to cut $500 billion in 1 year. Our view is that everything should be on the table. We issue each year a publication called Prime Cuts. $350 billion in 1 year, $2.2 trillion over 5 years. So to put that in perspective, $350 billion is 10% of the $3.5 trillion budget. And we're not leaving anything on the table. A lot of what people talk about in Washington these days is non-defense discretionary spending. And again, that means labor, education, health and human services, commerce, some of which we may or may not need, but you can't balance the budget by just cutting back on those programs. Entitlements are really the big problem. And even under some of the more radical plans to cut spending, if you want to call them that, or the ones that would cut the most, not a lot changes over the next 10 years. It's future benefits that need to be addressed. Baby boomers are starting to retire. No one's going to take away those benefits. It's a huge expense that we can't avoid. So the retirement age for my generation, the baby boomers, has been raised slightly, needs to be raised more. People are living longer, and they're working longer. And we're now much more of a service-oriented society than a manufacturing or any other kind of work society. So if somebody has been a postman or a letter carrier for many years, sure, they might not work that long. They obviously have different issues than somebody that has been sitting at a desk for 50 years, but we have to do something. And I look at this table of young people here, and I'm sure if they heard of Social Security and worry about it, will they get it, is really the question. So we really have an obligation to future generations. Thomas Jefferson once said, "We shall all consider ourselves unauthorized to saddle posterity with our debts and morally bound to pay them ourselves, and consequently within what may be deemed a period of a generation or the life expectancy of the majority." So that means it's our obligation to take care of the next generation. My father, and I know some of you here are part of the greatest generation, fought World War II, saved us from a terrible fate. We fight to keep our democracy free every single day. It's interesting to see the transition and our respect for the troops. I grew up, obviously, in the Vietnam era, and it was a very different feeling about why people were out there protecting our liberties. And now everybody understands why we're doing this. But we are going to lose them unless we protect them, and part of that protection is a fiscal responsibility, not just a national security responsibility. In fact, some of the Secretary Gates, Defense Secretary Gates, and others have said the biggest threat to the military and to the country is our national debt and the expenses that we have, because we won't be able to afford the protections that we really need. We can argue that there's money in defense that's wasted. There's no doubt about it. Citizens Against Government Waste, after the Grace Commission, helped publicize the $436 hammers and the $640 toilet seat at the Pentagon. And right now we're fighting one of the biggest earmarks of all, which is the alternate engine for the Joint Strike Fighter. The JSF, as it's called, is a $300 billion program. It's the largest aircraft program that the Pentagon has ever undertaken. It's going to replace the aircraft for all of the services, and it's a single-engine plane. The engine is being built by Pratt & Whitney. They won the competition. It's going fairly well. And yet Congress has earmarked more than $1.2 billion since 2004 for an alternate engine that is being built by General Electric and Rolls-Royce. So the members of Congress in whose states this particular project is being developed have fought against both Presidents Bush and Obama and Secretaries Rumsfeld and Gates, all of whom said we should get rid of this, and pushed through all of these earmarks over the past 6 years. When the President said on his, in his State of the Union on Tuesday that he would, quote unquote, veto any bill that contains earmarks, we do want to know exactly what he means. Because members of Congress seem to define this alternate engine as not an earmark. They seem to be playing around with the definitions in terms that allow them to get away with some of these expenditures. Some of the members, some Republicans in fact, said, we don't consider transportation projects to be earmarks. The Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska was one of the biggest earmarks ever. And transportation has been full of earmarks for quite a long time. There can't be any exceptions to the idea that earmarks should be eliminated. Interestingly, it was the Republicans that really got earmarks moving up when they took over for the first time in many years in 1994. The Speaker of the House at that time was Newt Gingrich, and he told the subcommittee chairman on the appropriations committees, who are called cardinals, to give you an idea of the power that they have, to stick these earmarks into the districts of vulnerable Republican freshmen. So they did. And earmarks went from $7.8 billion in 1994 to $29 billion in 2006. and was certainly one of the reasons that Republicans lost their majority. They became part of the problem. Democrats came in and they increased transparency. They reduced the amount and cost of earmarks down to $16.5 billion in 2010 and down again to about $8.7 billion in 2011, although it appears with the Republican moratorium and the President's comments that they probably won't have any of those. But having put out the first Congressional Pig Book in 1991 and written the first Congressional Pig Book, it's really gratifying to see that this issue has come around to the point where everybody realizes that it's just not worth the money, and it's at least a step in the right direction. But it is, unfortunately, a drop in the bucket compared to all of the expenditures that need to be addressed in Washington. And it is something that has gotten more publicity. The increased availability of the information has helped greatly. But looking at something like the alternate engine for the Joint Strike Fighter, that has to be eliminated. And that's also a Republican problem. In the votes that we calculated and tracked through our lobbying arm, the Council for Citizens Against Government Waste, there were 67 votes in 2009. This is on our website, but it's also our congressional ratings. 67 votes in 2009 on earmark-related amendments. 11 of those related to defense. On the non-defense earmarks, almost 90% of the time, a majority of Republicans voted to eliminate the funding. On the defense earmarks, they only voted twice as a majority to eliminate the funding. Interestingly, the Senate, where they usually earmark a lot more, they had a vote on this alternate engine, and they voted to eliminate the money. When the House voted, the entire Ohio delegation, which of course includes both John Boehner and Dennis Kucinich, voted to keep funding for the alternate engine. Why? Because GE has a facility in the state. Mike Pence from Indiana, good fiscal conservative, gets 95 to 100% of the votes on spending the right way in our view. He went to the floor during this debate over the alternate engine, and he said, in the interest of full disclosure, there's 4,000 jobs that Rolls-Royce has in my district related to this alternate engine. But that's not why I'm here defending it. It's a matter of national security. Well, at least he was honest about why he was really there, even though he denied it. These are parochial projects. This is something that the Pentagon has made very clear it doesn't want. And going back to what Hugh had spoken about, there are ways to get around even an earmark moratorium, and we plan to make sure that members don't do what they had done in the past, which is to pick up the phone and call an agency and say, there's no earmark written into this bill, but if you don't put this in my district, we're going to cut your funding next year. And that's one of the ways that they can get around even an earmark ban. Now, they won't have billions of dollars or tens of billions like they used to, but if a subcommittee chairman calls the Department of Defense and says, I really want this to go to this, to this particular company in my district, they'll have a competition, but it may not be a fair competition. And of course, letters, phone calls, they all need to be made public so that we know exactly what's going on. We look at a lot of other issues besides earmarks. We're looking at the overall levels of spending. We're looking at the agriculture programs. There's another big test of whether the new members are serious about cutting spending. If these new fiscal conservative Republicans from the Midwest will vote against additional subsidies, that's a big step, because a lot of these programs are not supported by one party or another. A lot of times it's based on geography. And in the past, the rural members of Congress have supported food stamp programs which benefit the cities more than anywhere else, and the members of the delegations from various cities have supported the subsidies because they think it helps to keep the prices down for various commodities, which really doesn't work. But you see the point. It's an interaction that has benefits, and it also makes it difficult to pick out areas of spending where you can get 218 votes in the House and 51 in the Senate to really reduce the size and scope of the government, because everybody has some interest and everyone wants something. Now, before I close, I want to ask everybody, would you like to see the United States eliminate the dollar bill and replace it with a dollar coin? I want you to raise your hands if you think that's a good idea. Okay. What if I told you it would save $550 million a year and that it's also good for the environment? Because the dollar coin lasts longer. We're the only industrialized country that has paper currency of such low value. Any of you that have been overseas and used the loonie or any other euro, anything like that, I don't think you've come home and said, gee, I really miss that paper currency that we have in the United States. And the Government Accountability Office will be issuing a new report on savings in March. So now that you all know this, what do you think about getting rid of the dollar bill and replacing it with a dollar coin? Okay? Better, better. Well, that's better than last time. Last time 3 people raised their hands at first, and I got 5 out of my comments. So I think it's sinking in a little. Again, a very logical issue. The Treasury, by the way, has the authority right now to just eliminate the dollar bill, but they won't because the Federal Reserve likes it. Obviously, Bureau of Engraving and Printing is fighting against the mint. And we've started to have a series of meetings with members of Congress. It's also something that, as individuals, you can do yourselves to save money. Go to the bank, ask for a dollar coin. You know, there are circulation issues with the dollar coin. They don't go out of the Federal Reserve at the same rate as quarters. There's the Susan B. Anthony problem. We can overcome all of this. So for $500 million, maybe more, it seems like a pretty simple thing to do. But we do find that there's a lot of resistance because people are just used to it. And once people understand this, it's, again, one of the easier ways to address our national debt problem. It won't solve it, but it's something that people can do to help. So we know we all need to take action sooner rather than later. We don't want to be the first generation to leave a lower standard of living to our children and grandchildren. And when you hear that within 10 years, our debt will be greater than our economic output, we all understand that something needs to be done. We may agree on a lot of these ways of changing the nature of Washington. We may disagree on the specifics, but it's a lot easier to reduce the spending than to keep sending money, because the minute that Washington gets more money, they spend it. So we want to see the spending cuts first. If they need to then raise taxes, fine, but let's start with the spending. It's a lot more logical, it's supported by more people, and we just need to keep sending that message. So thank you very much. Glad to answer any questions.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Thomas A. Schatz, President of Citizens Against Government Waste. We will return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We remind you that members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we hope everyone listening will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. Please visit our website, www.cityclub.org, to see a full schedule of our upcoming programs. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler, and we thank you for your support. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club membership and marketing manager Heather Sikora and program director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Welcome to the Cleveland City Club. Usually we get a much larger audience. Probably the weather's a factor. Maybe if we were talking about how to spend more money, there might be more people here. But one of the concerns we all have is education, and I notice that's not one of your targeted areas in your booklet, but I wonder if you have any perspective on that. Here in Cleveland, we're spending about $15,000 per student to educate, and we've got a 50% fallout rate. So it's not so much a question of spending, it's a question of production of quality output, the finished product. Do you have any comments or perspective on that? This is definitely an area that's got to change for, the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, there are earmarks in education. It's under labor, health and human services, and education. So within the pig book summary that I've provided, you will see some examples. And you'll see that it goes to members of the appropriations committees. For example, $500,000 for Weber State University for teacher education and curriculum development in, of course, Utah. Senator Bennett sits on the appropriations committee. So even the education money is sent to specific areas without competition. I live in D.C. where they spend even more per student, the most in the country, and it's a mess. There's a large group of people in this room, including myself and my generation, my father's generation, grew up without a Department of Education. So there's a federal role, or maybe there isn't a federal role. It's a large debate and a big question. I much prefer to see a lot of this money spent at the local level. State and local control of education, to me, is really the answer. It just seems to me we learned more and did better when we didn't have this big bureaucracy in Washington. It was created in 1977 under President Carter because they thought this was something the federal government should do. I'm not getting into the constitutional issue and the new rules in the House about providing a constitutional basis for everything they do, which is a new rule in the House. I just think it's something that needs to be addressed locally as much as possible, and that the federal government should have a lesser role than they do now. And like everything else, you need to provide results. And it's interesting, in Washington, D.C., Michelle Rhee, who was the, I forgot what her title was, Commissioner of Education or whatever she was, she really went after the infrastructure and the old ways of doing business in Washington. She was making progress. The new mayor came in, she's gone. And I just read the other day that they're, at what was my daughter's middle school, they're bringing back the principal that she kicked out. So, you need the right leadership, you need the right policies, and you need the right results. And my father was president of the Board of Education, so I have a fairly special feeling about this. Of course, I never missed a single class in high school, for obvious reasons. But we got a real feel for how education should be done. There's easy access to information about education at the local level, and that's really where it needs to start. Go to a school board meeting, get the information you need, and get involved, and just start demanding better results. It's your tax dollars that are being wasted if it doesn't work.
Mr. Schatz, I suggest you get rid of pennies next. But my question has to do with the debt reduction program recently recommended by Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson. Right. Would you and your organization favor that road to reducing our deficit and debt? And also, the three big elephants in the room really are Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Mm-hmm. How can you really think of serious debt reduction without making some rather draconian cuts in those programs?
I did mention that during my remarks, that earmarks are not the answer, that we do need to address Social Security, raise the retirement age, look at Medicare, Medicaid, obviously. And by the way, the penny and the nickel both cost more to make than they're worth, just as a point. But we're starting with the dollar bill and the dollar coin. Yes, the Fiscal Commission, a lot of the recommendations they made on the spending side were ideas that have been around for many, many years. We still firmly believe that unless the spending is addressed first, that they're just going to increase taxes and keep spending. It just has happened that way forever. There was the Graham-Rudman-Hollings law in the 1980s, set a cap on how much spending could increase. federal government doesn't have a balanced budget requirement. Most of the states not only have that, but they also have a line item veto for the governor. And it's been a very good way to control spending. Illinois is a good example of what not to do, as is California. And I know that the governors of Indiana, Wisconsin, and every other neighboring state to Illinois were thrilled when Illinois raised taxes, because there's going to be a flight of businesses and individuals. Society is very mobile these days. If your policies aren't conducive to attracting business, people are going to leave. The federal government, of course, it's a little different because you have to leave the country. But yes, we do have some ideas. Our Prime Cuts publication, which I did not bring, but you can get on our website, which is cagw.org. Recommendations there for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Of course, that leads into the whole Obamacare issue, which would take too long to talk about, whether it saves money or doesn't save money, and the fact that they have revenues coming in before they provide the benefits. I don't see any way that saves money. Washington tends to solve problems by just making everything too big. Let's take Medicare Part D. Right? Obviously, it's increased the deficit. It's worked a little better than they thought, but nonetheless, it's increased expenditures. As I recall, somewhere around 70 or 75% of seniors had some form of prescription drug coverage. So rather than letting them keep that, they decided to cover everyone. And that, unfortunately, is the way Washington works. They don't just solve a problem, they sometimes create a bigger problem by trying to solve a smaller problem. I mean, you could have solved that problem by providing vouchers or some other way for seniors that didn't have access to prescription drugs to get them without creating this whole new bureaucracy and this whole new program. And Medicare, of course, as is Social Security, is a transfer from one generation to the next. So your children and grandchildren, and eventually my children, are paying for my benefits. Social Security really was intended to be self-funding. I believe when it started, it was 16 workers for every retiree. And the first person that retired was a woman named Ida Mae Fuller. She was from Ludlow, Vermont, and she lived till she was 92. So she more than got what she put in, to say the least. And I think people need to understand how this all works. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a great, really liberal senator, said it's a Ponzi scheme. You know, it's one of the world's largest Ponzi scheme. It is simply not sustainable the way it's working right now. So taxes will have to be vastly increased, or benefits will have to be cut, or simply look at the incoming generation, the younger people, and have them self-fund for that particular program. So that's the short answer to a big question.
I have sort of a two-part question. The first one is, you and many members, new members of Congress, have focused a lot on expenditures, but the other side of the coin is income. And what do you think we should do to try and stimulate our elected leaders to do something meaningful about increasing the economic activity in this country, thereby generating tax revenue without raising rates?
Right.
The other question is, why don't we measure our national debt against our assets? I mean, I do that at home. Why don't people like you analyzing this take it that way?
Well, we've always thought there should be a capital budget. Certainly the government has a lot of value in property, excess property. We think they should sell that off. That would bring in billions of dollars. By the way, the debt that is published, the $14 trillion debt, is not the real debt. It's more like $130 trillion, because we have these unfunded liabilities that, unlike private businesses, the government doesn't account for. So their accounting is a mess. I mean, if they were a board of directors, they would all be fired based on how they keep the books. There's no doubt about it. So there's been talk about a capital budget. Some states have them. It allows you to plan ahead. You could look at infrastructure in that manner and say, okay, we're putting down this amount, and then in future years we're spending additional amounts. It would paint a different picture. There is a little bit of an issue, however, in valuing government assets, because there's not always a willing buyer. How do you value the Department of Defense? I mean, nobody's going to buy it. You can value the property, and by the way, they don't even do that very well. If you call the General Services Administration and you say, what's the value of government-owned property, they don't know. When President Reagan appointed the Grace Commission, Peter Grace was the co-chairman. Peter Grace was the chairman then of the W.R. Grace and Company. And one of the first questions that President Reagan asked Peter was to tell him a story about how when he was governor in California, he didn't know how many employees of the federal government were in California, where they were doing, where they were located, what they were doing. So he asked Peter Grace, and the Grace Commission, by the way, had 160 top corporate executives from around the country, 2,000 volunteers, never got an answer to that question. They could never tell the Grace Commission how many federal workers there were in California, where they were all located, and what they were doing. They can't keep track of inventory. We've seen that at the Pentagon and in other agencies. So your question is logical. It would be tough to evaluate all of the assets, but a good place to start is property, because there is a market for the property. On your tax question, the United States has, I believe, the, if not largest, maybe third highest corporate tax rate. One of the things that President Obama did talk about, and they've been kicking around for a while, is to reduce the corporate tax rate. And it's always been our belief that that would generate more revenue and there would be more certainty about what people would be paying in taxes so they could plan. If you pay less in taxes, you can hire more people. It's pretty simple math. They, in turn, generate more revenue, more sales, and more business. And that's why, and that's why in many ways there's competition among the states on tax rates. Now, that's kind of a good place to see how this all works. You know, they experiment with various rates. New York State has a higher rate than other states surrounding them, and so does California. So you see businesses moving to where they can pay lower rates and get a good quality workforce. So we'll see what happens with tax rates. They're certainly not going to raise taxes under the current economic circumstances.
In the next month or two, there's going to be a debate on the federal debt ceiling. What are your thoughts on raising it, or does keeping it where it is impose some sort of fiscal discipline?
There has to be something tied to the debt ceiling this time around, and I think everybody is recognizing that in Congress right now. There was initially a projection that they would have to vote on the debt ceiling before they extended the appropriations for the current fiscal year. That expires March 4th. Debt ceiling vote will be after that. So there will be an opportunity to look at the current expenditures. Republicans in the House have said they want to cut, they originally said $100 billion, but now it's down to $50 because of the length of the fiscal year. And they're just saying, let's do something right now. So it'll be interesting, and of course a test for a lot of these new members to determine what they are going to do or what they would want in exchange for agreeing to extend the debt ceiling. There have been 2 times where that didn't happen. That led to a government shutdown. It didn't work out so well for the members that decided to fight against the extension, and I don't think they're going to put themselves in that position this time around. There's things the government can do if they don't extend it immediately. It doesn't have to happen on March 4th, but I think for how the rest of the world views the United States, if they feel that we're not fulfilling our obligations or we're hesitating to do that, certainly based on the current fiscal circumstances, that probably wouldn't look too good.
Mr. Schatz, you mentioned with great concern the national debt and its effect upon the entire country. You didn't make any mention at all, though, about the 9% plus of Americans who are out of work, a very conservative figure, probably a lot more than that now. During the Great Depression, those of us who were around remember when unemployment was much more than 9%. And Franklin Roosevelt instituted a program of works programs, WPA and CCC, which created a certain amount of alleviation of the unemployment and at the same time left some very permanent improvements to our infrastructure. I know it costs a lot of money to do something like that now, and would probably add to the national debt. But what do you think would be a good way of reducing the unemployment we have now?
Well, they had a chance to do that with the stimulus package, $862 billion. I believe that maybe 15% of it was infrastructure. Most of it was expanding existing federal programs like weatherization, which really doesn't do much to create jobs and has also been found to be full of waste, fraud, and abuse. Unemployment, I believe, in the Depression was about 25%. So we have a big recession, obviously not a depression, but that still doesn't really help. One of the reasons they extended the tax cuts was to allow businesses to plan and start hiring people. The unemployment is a number of factors, but it's our view that the government doesn't create jobs. Businesses create jobs. And if you're going to take more money from businesses, they're not going to be able to create jobs. We would rather lower the tax rate, reduce the size and scope of the government, and that's how we think people are going to get jobs, not by just having the government decide we should do this or do that. Let's take high-speed rail, which I'm glad I got to mention. President talked about high-speed rail. We literally wrote a book about why it wouldn't work in the United States. Population density. This whole idea is geographically challenged. Think about how far the big cities are for the most part, except in the Northeast, where you have Washington, Baltimore, Philly, New York, Boston. You have the Acela. Even that doesn't make money. Amtrak, which is supposed to be self-funded, $37 billion later, hasn't paid back a penny. We can't do low-speed rail. How are we going to do high-speed rail? Some estimates are that high-speed rail will cost $132 million per mile. And I was interviewed by CBS TV, national CBS TV, on Wednesday, and the reporter was operating under the assumption that we absolutely have to do high-speed rail just like we did the interstate highway system. Well, the interstate highway system runs through everywhere. You're not going to have high-speed rail in Montana or North Dakota or South Dakota or Idaho. It's very limited in scope. Members of Congress are already taking this and dividing it up into areas that they favor. Congressman John Mica is chairman of the Transportation Committee in the House now, and he wants high-speed rail between Tampa and Orlando. What a surprise. Is that the best place in the country to do this? Probably not. California passed a bond issue for high-speed rail, $9 billion. Well, federal government's going to have to pony up at least $18 billion. None of us are probably going to get on that high-speed rail. So I said to the reporter, if you build a high-speed rail and there were no jobs at either end, what difference does it make? Senator Byrd paved over most of West Virginia, didn't improve the economy. And ironically, in that same speech, the president talked about expanding broadband. I'm not quite sure, by the way, how it became an entitlement for everybody to have a cell phone and access to the internet, but that's the direction they seem to be going in. So I said, well, if you have access to the internet and you can work from home, why do you need high-speed rail? And that's the kind of choice that, yeah, I had thought of that as I was sitting there, in fact. But it makes sense that if you're going to invest in something, think about what the result is going to be of that investment. Don't spend the money just because you want to spend the money or it looks pretty, like high-speed rail. I've been on the Acela. It's very nice. I only pay for it myself if it's cheaper than the alternative. In some cases, going back to Amtrak, it is cheaper to fly people from one city to another than it is to put them on Amtrak, including all the subsidies. They won't even eliminate the lines on Amtrak that are unprofitable, or the sleeper cars that nobody uses. So I think it's a wonderful idea. The president was in Europe. He said, this is great, looks beautiful, wouldn't work here the same way.
Back when President Clinton was president, he brought in Robert Reich as his labor secretary, as I recall, and Robert Reich loudly proclaimed and condemned corporate welfare. And here we are some 15-plus years later, and we have even more corporate welfare. And I'd like to ask you specifically about one type of corporate welfare, and that is green corporate welfare. All the money that is going towards subsidizing green energy, such as windmills, solar panels, hybrid cars, development of batteries, on and on it goes. And I'm interested to know if you know the total dollar amount of federal subsidies for this green energy and what you think about it.
I don't know the total dollar amount offhand. I know that in the stimulus they vastly expanded a lot of those programs. And of course, after the president's remarks, there were two members from Detroit, members of Congress from Detroit, who said, we have to spend billions more on electric cars. So the Volt and the, I forgot the other one, but the cars are between $35,000 and $40,000, right? You can, for half of that amount of money, you can buy a car that gets better mileage and people really want. The government can't force people to buy something they don't want. And part of that is what they're trying to do. There's nothing wrong with green energy. In fact, companies that see it as a way to improve efficiency and save money will do it if it works. But right now, all of those forms of energy are about 1% of our use. I think at best people say it could become 5 or 10%. I've always said if the sun could create energy and light the world, we would have done it by now. Right? It's not cheap, and it's not easy. Wind energy, even some environmental groups that previously supported it aren't happy about it anymore. And it is also limited because there is no grid near the places where you'd have to put the windmills. So when Boone Pickens went on the air and he said, let's do this, he was waiting for the government to say, we'll build the grid for you, because it's extremely expensive. You know, the way things are laid out now, it's based on the current sources of energy. There's a lot that we could do with the energy sources we have now. Obviously, after the oil spill, they cut off the idea of offshore exploration, or they severely limited it. We have tremendous natural gas opportunities and resources that could be explored. I just don't understand why, when the question is asked about less dependence on OPEC, that the answer seems to be alternative energy versus exploring what we have ourselves. Kind of, it's okay for them to, drill for oil, but apparently it's not okay for us in some circumstances. And we should be doing all of that because all of it is needed. We have more coal, I believe, than anywhere else in the world. And yet, that's something else. It's dirty, it's horrible. Well, you're not going to get enough out of the sun or the wind or anything else. And in the meantime, the energy costs are going to go up because they're not exploring anything new.
It seems like this cost-cutting requires a champion. Is Paul Ryan that champion? And how does the average citizen, other than by subscribing to your material, make an impact here?
Well, I've known Paul since he was a staffer on Capitol Hill, and we always knew that he was very sharp and very good at what he does. I don't really care if it's a Republican or a Democrat. There has to be a logical explanation that people really understand if someone is going to reduce anything. Right? If you say to someone, we're going to cut back in order to go ahead, well, it doesn't always sound that good. We're going to reduce something because we plan to succeed as a result of reducing whatever it might be. It's not an easy message to sell. It's always easier to sell the high-speed rail or everything that we're going to do as an investment, which is a euphemism for more spending, to say the least. And whether it's Paul Ryan or someone else, that communication has to be done in a way that people will not just understand, but also push forward through the members of Congress. There's little doubt that what the Tea Party did and these new members was really a response to all of the excesses in Washington. In 1989, through our lobbying group, again, the Council for Citizens Against Government Leaks, we started Taxpayers Action Day. No one heard of it because it wasn't on the internet back then. We did it through letters and phone calls and radio talk show hosts. We had rallies in cities all over the country, including Cleveland, for 4 or 5 years. As a result, in part, more fiscal conservatives came to Washington. We stopped holding the rallies. And guess what? 12 years later, they were kicked out because they spent too much money. So it's not just about electing people and getting involved just on one day, to answer your question about getting involved. The access to information is greater than ever. The ability to respond is greater than ever. And I think there's a greater respect for people's opinions than there have been in the past. We send out emails. We have something called e-news we do once a month. We try to alert people when there are issues that they should be involved with and get them to correspond with their members of Congress. Town hall meetings are a lot of ways that would really help in terms of getting the message through. The town hall meetings on the health care bill, it didn't stop it, but I think that had an impact further down the road on the election. Good.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Thomas A. Schatz, President, Citizens Against Government Waste. Thank you, Mr. Schatz. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.